I did this completely ridiculous thing. In August of 2017, contacted I contacted members of the federal government as well as the Texas government, and then the next day I filed a formal petition with the Texas Supreme Court. And one of the things I did is I acknowledged myself in what I understood to be a line of succession regarding the federal government concerning a task force called the Fraud Enforcement Task Force that had been established under President Barack Obama. And among the things this task force did is it identified certain federal departments in a series of departments that were a part of task force, and this one was supposedly about fighting fraud. Now, I came to have concerns at a certain point that this task force was like other things that had happened, where it had been coded that it was a negative, that it was actually about enforcing fraud as opposed to something like law enforcement, that it was one of those crypto flip things where it presents as if it is about tracking and stopping fraud. But really what it is about laundering schemes and techniques that have been identified through other agencies that have some sort of data collection concerning illegal activities so that it can be flipped and then it can be used by the hustlers to work the hustle. And so it was one of those things. Are you enforcing fraud or are you fighting fraud? Nonetheless, I'd worked for a department connected to the Health and Human Services and was, as I understood, required by law as a mandated reporter to report on acts of fraud, including acts of fraud that may have national security implications, as I understood at the beginning of August of 2017 what I was witnessing did. Now, when Barack Obama was president, he apparently vetoed many bills, many pieces of legislation. One of the bills he vetoed is called the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, S-2040. He vetoed this bill, but then Congress overrode the veto. And I have an understanding that when Congress overrides a presidential veto, this is a very, very significant act. That the power of veto is very, very important, but so is the power to override a veto. So when you're the president, if you veto something, especially if there is a substantial majority of Congress supporting that bill, when you veto it, you run a very, very significant risk that they may override your veto, and then that sort of posits you as the negative, right? As the counterparty. And in this case, we're talking about a bill that discussed restitution for victims of terrorism within the United States against nation states that were not declared to be terrorist entities by the United States government. Now, this has a way of identifying things post-September 11th specifically, and it's sponsored by somebody who is a senator from Texas, but who was also the Attorney General of Texas during very important time frames during which the current bioterror attack that is occurring on the planet, on a planetary scale, on a global scale, was rolled out, and the means by which it could be accomplished were effectuated. It's an ironic thing. If, in fact, the former president of the United States was taking some sort of extra constitutional action in order to put himself into a position to mount a shadow government to effectuate a global bioterror attack, did anything he did as president have any legitimacy? And would it be appropriate for me to claim that I had any authority insofar as I may or may not be associated with anything that was authorized by him? This is an important question. The only time I ever actually acknowledged his authority is when I acknowledged that task force. Now, that task force was later rescinded by an executive order from President Donald Trump. And I understand that this S-2040 is very important in acknowledging that on this specific occasion, in this specific manner, Congress, by an overwhelming majority, and the Senate, by an overwhelming majority, repudiated who was acknowledged at the time as being the President of the United States in his efforts to command authority when it came to matters regarding financing for acts of terrorism. Now, I've contended that the senator who was the major sponsor is himself complicit with crimes against this country. I believe he deserves to be impeached at the least, not only for what he's done as a senator, which has been completely unacceptable, but also for what he did as Attorney General of Texas, which is aiding and abetting the proliferation of the current terror regime based upon a refusal to hold accountable specifically members of the Texas Insurance Commission and Texas-based entities, including those in the gas and oil sector, that were using efforts they had already established through other government agencies, including the Department of Energy and the Department of State, to effectuate the September 11th terrorist attacks. And I also believe they co-conspired to cover up for the fact that there was plenty of actual legitimate intelligence by members of actual national intelligence that had already been provided to the appropriate authorities in order to be acted upon. But rather, what happened was, as people were waiting for the implementation of changes to the state laws of Texas, which impacted the entirety of the insurance industry, that those intelligence reports were stolen, and rather than being acted upon as intelligence that could prevent a national security incident, they were instead used as underwriting on insurance, including insurance that later became the Terrorist Risk Insurance Program, which was funded with trillions of dollars of backing from the federal government and has been strategically targeted and infiltrated and defrauded for the last 3 years, while certain places are allowed to mischaracterize their insurance billing needs in order to privatize certain aspects into select insurance markets that are really about covering up for war crimes. When you force cybernetically enhance people since they're a child, and you lie about it and say it's medical related, and then require them to get health insurance so that they are obligated to pay for the manners in which you are torturing them, and then years down the road, try to say the problems with their non-compliance are about cybersecurity, it's a war crime. There's no veto power that you have to say, well, yes, it's a war crime, but I'm the senator, I'm the attorney general, I'm the president. When are you going to impeach Obama? When are you going to impeach a former president that right now is operating a shadow government with fake authority to operate a global bioterror attack in conjunction with people that have every intention of poaching off of what remains of the federal government after it's been bankrupted by people that should never have been in public office to begin with? When are you going to impeach him? I already have. I've already impeached John Cornyn. But the question remains, what happens to the other 25 co-sponsors of that bill and every member of Congress and the Senate that voted to approve it and then voted to override the president's veto?